Our big takeaways from some marquee matchups, the Chiefs and Dolphins, the Eagles and Cowboys, the Bengals and Bills, everything else from week 9. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find Stealing Signals in your inbox. Sign up at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, we're doing the Sunday night recording. It's good to be back. We haven't done it for the last few weeks. I forgot what it's like to record at night. I'm ready to go to sleep. How you doing?
Depends. Like I was sleeping during the second half of the Sunday night game. Don't really know what's happened. Started this morning before a normal human being should need to wake up. Did some waivers. I mean, Ben, fantasy football has a lot going on these days. You have Sunday morning waivers in your main event leagues where you're trying to fill out your rosters. Then you have these games in another continent. I have to say that I wasn't surprised at the caliber of play in Chiefs Dolphins after having, I know I've mentioned this several times, but it was a very memorable, and not in a good way, experience flying back from Europe recently. I certainly don't wish that travel on anybody. Although the Kansas City Chiefs last week, their trap game, they were awful against the Denver Broncos. They reestablished themselves as probably with the Baltimore Ravens, although the two teams on Monday Night Football also going to be, or I should say Sunday Night Football, going to be in the mix for that. But Ravens, Chiefs looked very good today. The Chiefs defense, Ben, that's weird to say, but they may be one of the top 2 or 3 defenses in the entire NFL, which gives them a little bit of a chance to, work through whatever is going on in their offense. Their offensive numbers are still pretty good, big picture, but they don't feel explosive. They don't seem good for the Chiefs. I was saying last year I thought Travis Kelce might get defensive attention and get slowed down. That did not happen, but it is happening now in 2023. But yeah, it's an interesting fantasy day because you get that Europe game early in the morning. Then you have a couple of waves, and then you have the Sunday night game. A lot of fun, a lot of games. Also, one of the things that you wanted to talk about, and we can probably jump right into it.
Well, let's talk about the Chiefs and Dolphins for a sec. You said a lot of interesting stuff there. That Mahomes throws for 185 in this game. No one catches more than 35 receiving yards. You mentioned Kelce catches only 3 balls for 14 yards. The big ridiculous stat about whether Taylor Swift's in attendance or not impacting his play. She was not, so that's why he only had 14 yards. Most important stat in all fantasy sports right now does seem to be nailing. But one of the fascinating things you mentioned with your travel, one of the things that I've noticed in doing some of the betting stuff over at Stealing Lines is the travel. Certain teams are coming early in the week. Certain teams are coming later in the week for some of these international games. Like when the Bills and the Jags played, the Jags, well, they were there the whole week prior because they had played the week prior. The Bills traveled over on like Friday and played like 2 days later after, a 5-hour difference. And they looked it. They looked a little bit jet lagged, came out really slow and flat against Jacksonville and lost that game. I can't immediately think of the other game where we had one team traveling early in the week and getting there on like Tuesday and taking a day off on Tuesday and then practicing over there Wednesday, Thursday, Friday versus a team that got there on like Friday. And the team with more rest won. I bring this up because the inverse was true here, where the Dolphins got over there early in the week, got established in Germany, and presumably were more adjusted. The Chiefs came a lot later in the week. I think they flew overnight Thursday to Friday. They got there Friday morning, did a light Friday walkthrough, and then, played 2 days later, basically. I literally think it makes their win that much more impressive. You said it was good that they came back from that trap game, had a big win. They also did it despite what I think was probably suboptimal travel standards. It's like the best that we've seen a team with the late travel this year respond. And they looked good early in the game, at least. They did run into their offensive struggles, but they got out to an early lead and were playing from ahead scored on their first drive, looked sharp on their first drive, which is another trend we've seen a lot this year, Sean. And I've seen some interesting tweets and commentary about that, where we're seeing teams look good early in games and then not as good later. Like the scripted plays and the things they want to get to are working, and then they're not able to adjust to what defenses adjust to what they did in the early part of the game. Whatever answers they have in the early part of the game, the defense makes a little adjustment, and then the offense is screwed. They can only find one little thing, and that was it. That's what it feels like. Similar for Kansas City here.
It is interesting, though, when you think about scripted plays, that this first drive, this first play here is a 21-yard pass to MVS. Then you get a short little play to Kelsey. You get a handoff to Pacheco. We know those are always exciting. Then you get a Sky Moore reception. And, Ben, there was some unintentional humor in this game where at one point, Kadarius Toney caught a pass and ran for some yardage, and he celebrated as though they had just won the Super Bowl after he caught his pass.
We got some people on Twitter that were like, you got to have Kadarius Toney, like he still matters. And I was like, guys, come on. We've been here. We've done this.
When Sky Moore caught his second pass, he celebrated as though they had just won the Super Bowl. I mean, these two players, I believe, combined for 3 receptions. But the fact that they had 3 receptions instead of 0 really was meaningful and pivotal to them, which, I mean, I shouldn't joke about that. It is good for them that they were involved. It's so weird and so sad for the Chiefs team that their receivers are so bad that McCole Hardman is back to being the manufactured touch guy. And they were getting huge celebrations when the players who were supposed to be the starters. I mean, you mentioned again, like these scripted plays, you have then
that one was Sky
that was
Moore
a good play.
Yeah, Sky Moore was at tailback and basically like an offset I formation, and Patrick Mahomes was under center, and he threw to Sky Moore in just a run right into the flat out of the tailback position. I mean, if that's the way you got to manufacture Sky Moore getting to catch, like we'll take it any way we can get it.
Well, the Chiefs have collected a lot of guys who can only catch the ball behind the line of scrimmage. And even when you're Andy Reid, even when you're Patrick Mahomes, there's a limited amount of use for that, which is one of the reasons why you're seeing Noah Gray involved here. It's one of the reasons why, I mean, Justin Watson was the only player on the Chiefs who managed 5 targets. They had like 13 guys with targets in this game, something absurd like that. But you get the Watson play here as well. And then you get Rashee Rice. So a lot of people involved in this drive. The play is not exactly dynamic, and yet you contrast that to the entire rest of the game where neither the Chiefs nor the Miami Dolphins moved the ball that well. And I think the claim that you made there, the thesis that you started out with, that the scripted plays, even though they're not dynamic, and even though, I mean, you're not really getting Travis Kelce involved, but at some point, I mean, the Chiefs do have to use the players on their team. They simply do not have any dynamism whatsoever. And yet, because of Patrick Mahomes, because of Andy Reid, and now because of this ascending defense, 7-2, they're still winning games. I mean, this Miami Dolphins team is good. The big note here from a narrative perspective is that Tyreek Hill, I mean, he had to have wanted to play big in this game. He wants to play big in all the games. He's someone who definitely enjoys the limelight that comes with what he's done this season, and what he's done this season has been just absolutely stunning. He did not play well in this game. The fumble 6 more or less lost him the game, but in addition to that, they shut him down. And certainly for the Chiefs, it was also big because, I mean, they've watched what he has done in this different system, and they certainly were saying, you're going to have to beat us with guys like Jalen Waddle, and the Miami Dolphins could not.
Yeah, I mean, Waddle hurts his lower back. Was it? No, I'm thinking of the Jamar Chase injury. Waddle hurt his leg early in this one, and had hurt his back prior. But yeah, leg injury blocking on a run play. I was checking my notes. He continued to play throughout the game. Definitely was off the field for extended periods. Cedric Wilson ends up catching a 31-yard TD when they broke that play down really the only two downfield routes were Tyreek Hill running kind of one of his middle of the field routes, and Wilson running kind of a flag over the top of it. You had Braxton Berrios and the other flat. I'm pretty sure Waddle was not on the field, that it was 11 personnel. You had a 6-man protection, I think the broadcast was saying. So I think there was a tight end in there. I didn't really get a full glimpse of all of it. It was just a quick replay, but I know there's a running back on the field too. Point being, pretty sure Cedric Wilson was running a Jalen Waddle route when he caught his 31-yard TD, because Waddle wasn't playing every snap. He was coming in just periodically, which was exciting if you're a Waddle manager to know that he wasn't out there for the touchdown that was probably going to go to him.
A frustrating play, in part because Cedric Wilson actually goes up and makes a play on the ball.
Makes a good play,
letting the ball play him. It is the case, however, that other than that play, where he did a fantastic job, and that was his only catch on 5 targets. I mean, the Chiefs completely locked these guys down. Jalen Waddle, only 42 yards there. He does have a little bit more as a runner. I mean, Raheem Mostert played well in this one. He gets that touchdown to bring them back to 21-14. But, I mean, this looked like the Dolphins in that stretch last season where there was all the discussion of whether or not they'd been figured out. And we're going to have some of those discussions again, unless they come right back and are more dynamic next week. We had kind of one of these plays in this game where they're kind of trying to get the ball deep and, somewhat up the middle to Tyreek Hill. Tua throws it barely behind him. But, I mean, that's the kind of play where an elite receiver has to go up and make a play on the ball. Hill doesn't haul that one in. I mean, this is a weaker game from Tagovailoa, but didn't get help from his receivers. And one of the things here, too, it's not really a fantasy note unless you're playing the Chiefs defense, which would have been hard to do today in the circumstances. But once they get that strip and that play is going, you get a lateral to a teammate. And then one of the cool things here is not only did the guy who came down with the recovery lateral it, he immediately turns around and makes a block. And I don't know that there's that much more frustrating, Ben, from a reality perspective. It doesn't come into fantasy that often, again, unless you're playing these defenses, but you see a defender make an interception or you pick up a fumble and immediately these guys run the ball out of bounds as if they don't want to get hit themselves, and then they go down and party with all their teammates. Once you have the ball, make it as easy on your offense as possible, and in this case, go score a touchdown. If they don't lateral and then fight for that touchdown there, the Chiefs did nothing after those early possessions. They could have very easily lost this game that the Dolphins controlled in the second half. One play where the guys actually tried all the way through, and I mean, celebrate once you've scored the touchdown. They get the defensive score there that wins them the game. It could win them the number 1 seed in the AFC. I think you really like to see that from your defense.
Yeah, I do. I think that's a great point about the returns. I mean, you're talking about needing to be tackled by 11 guys. One of them is the quarterback who's not looking for any contact. 5 of them are offensive linemen who are not going to be able to run you down when you're a defensive back on the edge. And the other 5 are skill position guys, often lighter wide receivers these days in the NFL. There's tight ends that are, can be dangerous. You can get the Ben Watson play where he ran down Champ Bailey all those years ago. You got a wide receiver like a DK Metcalf. You can get that, him running down Budda Baker. Like there are some guys that are going to do some things from the offensive side that are going to go make a tackle, but not a lot of guys on Miami's team, which is built for speed, as we always talk about. And Tyreek got blocked on that play you mentioned. Not a lot of other dudes that are like on their skill position group. That's not like Jalen Waddle's going to go lay somebody out. So it does, I think, make a lot of sense. And over the years, I mean, we've seen things like in college back in the day, long field goals being returned. And they always would say, like, the reason that happens is you have the field goal unit out there. You got a kicker, a holder, and a whole bunch of big blockers that are not going to run anyone down. If you get a return on that spot, they don't have anybody to tackle you. I mean, there's nobody with any tackling experience, no real athleticism. It's like the long returns are certainly more possible when that's the other 11 guys on the field, when the play gets flipped like that and you're not expecting a return. So I'm totally with you on that. They got to be doing more of that where they can. It was smart and it was a strong play. You mentioned the Waddle run and some of Miami's issues. And I think the Waddle run was an interesting one for me because I thought it was a good example of Kansas City's defense, I think you talked about they shut down Tyreek Hill. He still catches 8 passes. So like that's the way his season's been going. That's him getting shut down. 8 catches for 62 yards on 10 targets. Got a couple plays in the middle of the field where they've been able to get him open in that area. Our buddy Pat Kerrane calls the splash zone that Miami attacks so well, that deep middle. Did get a couple of those opportunities in this game, but not as many as usual. Not a lot of yak after those. And then everything else was around the line of scrimmage, but usually covered up really quick. And they were really gravitating towards him around the line of scrimmage, I noticed. And that's why I brought up the Waddle run. It was a reverse where it was a Tyreek handoff one way, a pitch to Waddle going back the other way. And Waddle had all this room to run. As Miami needs to learn where to go next, when teams start to take away Tyreek Hill, they got to be able to go to Waddle. They got to be able to go to, obviously, Mostert and the running backs, but other guys on their roster, and especially in the passing game, are going to need to start to be more reliable. Waddle had the big game against New England last week. Definitely would like to see him get going a little more. Probably the fact that he got the knee injury early and didn't play a ton of snaps in this game. I don't know his actual snap share while we record here, but my guess is it's like 40% to 50%. I don't think he played a lot in this game. I think that would be, that might be high. Maybe he got to 60%, but I don't think there's any shot he finishes at 70% snaps. I'm just guessing again, but he was out of a lot of this. And I think he would have been their answer for a lot of what KC was trying to do. That reverse came early in the game before he got hit, I believe. And worked.
It was a couple plays after. And so that gave you the sense that maybe he's going to come back and be all right. Some of it is just that, I think that once you have the injury, and I was definitely watching him closely too. Obviously, you and I share teams, but then, we also have plenty of Waddle just in general. So you're desperately hoping that he's the guy who's going to come make some of those plays. And so when you're watching and he's not in there, that part is very frustrating. But as you kind of note here, they don't have other options. So they can't just go to the next wave of players. The thing with Waddle, even last week, when he does score well in fantasy, leaves plays on the field, he's not physical in general like Tyreek Hill is. He's not physical at the catch point. I still think that he's a big part of their offense. The speed is something that you can't just replace by, going to other players. But, this gives a sense of why Tyreek Hill is so involved every week, beyond just his own greatness, but also why losing Achane was a big deal, especially within the context of Mostert not being 100%. Now, Mostert does play mostly at the running back position here today, but, they work in 3 carries to Salvon Ahmed. Ahmed also gets 3 targets in this game. Those are 6 opportunities that you probably would prefer to have to other guys. There aren't a huge number of plays for the Dolphins overall in this game. Once they have Achane back, and I don't know that definitively, but the things that have been out there seem to have been fairly positive. You get back to having just so many guys with the elite speed. The Dolphins have cracked the code in so many ways, and yet it's still going to be an NFL football game. It's still going to rely on execution and, in some ways, perfection from Tua. So any game in which you have some of their guys injured, any game in which the opposing defense plays well, and Tua isn't at his very top level, then you have the potential for some outcomes like this.
Yeah, I agree with that. With the Waddle thing, we talked a little bit recently about how the number ones are maybe getting more stuff sort of designed for them, and depending on the defensive looks, some of the single-high looks, etc. I guess I think that they're going. I'm with you that Achane's a real key here. I think they're these teams that are getting into these spots. I bet the Eagles are going to start to hit it. I bet the Bengals are going to start to hit it, and really AJ Brown didn't have, I think, a monster game today. He did well. Jamar Chase didn't have a monster game today. Those guys have been their whole passing games for weeks. As teams focus on taking away that receiver, we saw it in the Raider game today, for example. I thought Devontae Adams might have a big game. Josh McDaniels ousted. But the broadcast was highlighting the way that they were bracket covering him. New York was, and they were like, he was running a slant on a pattern, and then the cornerback kind of played a trail technique, and the safety was just standing right where his slant was going to run. I mean, and Adams just kind of stopped running, and it was, they're just showing that you're putting two guys on him. There's nowhere he can go. They all just kind of stood in that area, and it wasn't like the defender had multiple options and was, shading towards Adams. It was a clear, full-on double coverage. They weren't rolling a safety. It was a double coverage. It was two guys man covered. And you do that when you have Davante Adams sometimes. Not every snap, but you're going to do it sometimes because he's Davante Adams. He can beat single coverage. And teams are going to do it with Tyreek Hill, or they're going to roll coverages or whatever, and Brown and all these guys. And when that happens, I think what these offenses are going to have to do, and what Mike McDaniel's going to have to do, and sort of my point with that run plan, some of the other stuff, is intentionally design stuff for the number two at that point, where I think a lot of this stuff with like the first read targets and things we've been seeing have been able to attack the number ones. But then it's not like rocket science. Once the number one starts to get double covered, you have to go to those single coverage, and you've got to be thinking, how do we make it look like we want to go to Tyreek, but go to Waddle, right? And something like the reverse run was a decent enough example. That same concept has to apply to the passing game.
And I just think those guys have to make plays when they're given a chance. When you look at Waddle and you go back to his collegiate numbers, it's a weird sort of dynamic because he was well behind a lot of those other Alabama receivers from a routes perspective at different junctures. And yet the yards per route number for Waddle just, absolutely over the moon. And so we know that he could produce in that circumstance, and then he comes out pre Tyreek Hill as a rookie and is a massive target hog. Now, many of those targets right at the line of scrimmage, right? And that was one of the things where once you get the new coaching staff, the more or less new quarterback with Tua playing more and playing very differently, and then once you have Tyreek Hill in there, his second season was dramatically different from an ADOT perspective, from a route perspective, but still very productive. His numbers through a couple of years, again, just extremely high quality. And yet we're looking at in this season and some of the things that maybe you go back in time and look at it and say, maybe this is why he played behind so many of those other guys at Alabama. Maybe this is why when they were trying to manufacture touches for him as a rookie, everything was just right there at the line of scrimmage, because and doesn't necessarily have that ability that we saw today from Devontae Smith, where because of some of the things the Cowboys were doing and trying to take A.J. Brown away, and they didn't fully succeed, the Eagles do get him a touchdown in there in short yardage, where sadly DeAndre Swift could not get any of those touchdowns in, played pretty well between the 20s, but man, blew a lot of green zone looks. If you were playing DeAndre Swift, you're pretty disappointed about that. But you get the touchdown there to A.J. Brown. But the long plays, the splash plays today for the Eagles were especially that long touchdown to Smith. Then he has another amazing grab later where he's kind of pushed out of bounds. The throw took him out of bounds. But when you make those two plays in the air on the ball, even if one of them is out of bounds, the opposing defense knows they have to account for that. The quarterback knows he can throw that ball and you're going to go make the play. One of the things the Bengals have been looking for is a healthy version of T. Higgins who can take a little bit of that pressure off of Jamar Chase. The big time number twos that we're looking to score and that were, either second or third round picks in fantasy, the reason that they get picked there is because we believe they're stars in their own rights. And I still want to believe that about Jalen Waddle, but he has got to make some plays in NFL games in the season 2023, both for the Dolphins and for fantasy managers, if that's going to continue to be the case.
We have had a lot of exposure to Jalen Waddle. I'm sensing some frustration from watching a lot of fantasy points left out there. Seeping through a little bit, Sean. Let's talk about another guy that we like. Sam Howell had a great game today. Took a couple of sacks. I've been watching the sacks number maybe more than they should be.
Well, one of the sacks today was when he slid at the line of scrimmage and ends up getting marked down, which, it's a sack, but it's not one of those drive-killing sacks, which he's had in the past, and they have been devastating. And you look at the last 2 weeks combined, and just so positive from that perspective because he really was hurting the team with all the sacks. But I think also schematically and blocking wise, the Commanders were putting him in bad situations that you just really haven't seen the last couple of weeks. And you would expect teams like the Eagles and the Patriots to be two of the teams that would give him the most trouble, to have thrived in those two environments. I mean, I'm a true believer, but I mean, I'm ready to say, I mean, he looks not just good. I mean, he looks really, really good. This was a situation today where if Terry McLaurin goes up and makes a good play on the ball, now that ball could have been there earlier, and I think it would have been an easy touchdown because McLaurin had separated. I mean, he was wide open for an easy score, but the ball does get to him. He gets pushed as he's trying to make a play on the ball. It's again a situation where, like, if you're a star, you got to catch that pass. If he catches that, you kind of have a blowout victory there. They do. I mean, the Commanders have done some weird things in games where they've made turnovers, and Howell himself was responsible for a huge one today where he made 45 pass attempts today, 44 brilliant. The 45th one was maybe the worst pass we'll see all season. But I mean, he looked so good.
Yeah, like 3 plays before that, he had De'Ami Brown in the end zone. If I'm not mistaken, I'm looking at the game long. It was the play 3 plays before it to De'Ami Brown. I know he threw a really good pass just before that interception on that drive that should have been caught for a TD. I was trying to see if that was a McLaurin play. I remember the McLaurin play you're describing. It was not the McLaurin play. The play after that was another pass to Bates, their backup tight end. John Bates, is it? Where he was open and Howell kind of did sail it on him a little bit. And it was like 2 plays in a row. We're like, man, he should have had a TD. First one was on the receiver. Maybe the second one was a little bit on Howell. And then a couple plays after that, he throws the really bad interception in the end zone. And you're like, man, this has just been a wild experience on this final drive of the half. He had converted a 3rd and 23 just prior to that with a 24-yard scramble, breaking tackles like a freaking fullback out there.
And he's throwing fall away passes to guys 20, 30, 40 yards downfield at the sideline, dropping it in like it's a handoff.
Right.
And again, I mean, if you're predisposed to see it in a positive light, like I definitely am, like I believe you are, I mean, you're going to play that up in your mind. You're going to minimize some of the mistakes. But Ben, I mean, out of the best 30 throws today, I mean, probably 12 to 13 of them came from Sam Howell. I haven't watched the Houston Texans game yet. I have a sense that a decent number of them came from CJ Stroud. Obviously, you get some good performances in the night game.
More than even from Howell. You're going to enjoy watching the Stroud game because that was a phenomenal performance for some big-time throws.
But just so encouraging today, too, to see back-to-back performances from Jahan Dotson and the touchdown to Dotson again. Just one of these passes.
That's where I was going to go. He threw that interception. He had that drive. That was his last throw of the first half, was that pick in the end zone that was so bad. He comes back first drive of the second half and leads a touchdown drive with a beautiful pass to Jahan Dotson for the touchdown on the other end of that. So many young quarterbacks, you get a drop from the De'Ami Brown play. Maybe you miss the throw to the Bates that I was describing. Then you end up throwing a pick, and it carries over into the next half or the next series or whatever. With Howell, I mean, one of the things you have to say about him, it is a little bit wild. He does take sacks, etc., but he will bounce back from a sack the very next play and throw the best pass you've seen him throw all day. Like, he has that, there's been described a million different ways, whether it's the ability, what do they call it? The memory loss, short-term memory loss, the ability to just wipe it, right after the play. Or, I mean, the other way to describe it is just like, he's consistent down to down and is not, influenced by poor play. The quarterback on the other side of the field in this game, Sean, I would say, is easily influenced by stuff. Mac Jones, we talked about him on the show a decent amount. I thought he was terrible in this game. And I think Mac Jones can't play at this point. And I think I probably won't get a ton of pushback from a lot of the listeners or anything like that. But I'm at the point where I'm like, I don't know what he brings. He doesn't have any mobility. And there's a lot of throws in this game. He got bailed out even a couple of times. There's a 4th down late where Juju Smith-Schuster makes a really nice catch. It's a low, wild throw on a reasonably short 4th down throw. You have to complete or the game's over. Then they get up into field goal range. He winds up firing a pass into coverage and throwing a pick, or not into field goal range, but close to field goal range in a 3-point game. I was tracking this so closely because I had the over in this game, and New England had a terrible second half. The over should have hit. It was 40.5. if the Patriots kick the field goal, they're going to tie it up at 20 and get to 40, and someone's going to win. And as long as it doesn't go and become a tie, someone's going to win, and that game's going to go over. But
Ben, I mean, you're talking about a game here where Demario Douglas, who was not a good college player, is the wide receiver 1, 7 targets. Juju Smith-Schuster, who, if they had anybody else, they would have benched and possibly cut at this point. I mean, cut may be a little bit strong because they paid him a bunch of undeserved money. He has 7 targets, and he's responsible for the interception that ends the game. Where, I mean, he may have bailed Mac Jones out earlier in the drive, but Mac Jones makes the perfect pass, puts it exactly where you have to put it. And, I mean, Juju doesn't just drop it. He manages to hit it in such a way that it bounces up to the defender behind him. One of the things that frustrated me a little bit.
He also threw a really good deep ball to Jalen Reagor at a key spot, and Jalen Reagor Jalen Reagor's still playing, and he plays for the Patriots now, but he's dropping long deep balls. In case anyone was wondering what he's doing.
That play, Ben, was so reminiscent of my note about Sky Moore last week, where it's not even exactly a drop, because despite the perfection of the pass, he couldn't even get both hands on it. You rewatch it from different angles, and you're like, at the very least, drop it. Put your hands on the ball. It was sad because, I mean, he gets open. He's athletic. You'd love to see a redemption story from him.
It's a little like playing catch with a small child, where you're like, put your hands out there and let me try and throw it into your hands, and hopefully you'll be able to catch it.
6 targets for Jalen Reagor, 1 reception. I think that Mac Jones is an above average NFL quarterback, or could be, but I mean, he needs to be on a different NFL team. It's kind of one of these situations where all these teams who are kind of in the mix, who had their quarterbacks hurt in the last couple of weeks, you wish that they had been able to trade for quarterbacks on teams that are going nowhere, who kind of need a fresh start. So that part would have been nice. As you were mentioning to me, there may have been a quarterback in the Packers-Rams game who shouldn't be on an NFL field, and that's beyond the obvious of Jordan Love. But Ben, the one you were most excited about today, before I mention that, and say, this week we claimed you should trade for Ramondre Stevenson. He somehow rushes for 64 yards, where I think the Commanders defenders all actively ran away from him on that play. Ramondre Stevenson back in the RB1 mix. Ben, there was a team that made a trade for a QB not to play this week, and yet play this week he did, and it worked out for them in a big way.
Yeah, I mean, the Joshua Dobbs story was insane. It was the talk of Twitter. I'm sure anyone listening to this has heard all about it, but Jaren Hall got the start. He gets injured. He gets knocked out of the game. Dobbs comes in, and he leads them to a come-from-behind victory. He throws for 158 yards and 2 touchdowns. He runs for 66 more in a TD, has several really key scrambles on third downs late. Atlanta takes the lead with, what was it left? Just over 2 minutes left in the game. Minnesota comes back and travels the length of the field. Dobbs had a run on a 4th and 7 that he converted. Threw a pass for a completion on a 3rd down earlier in the drive. Ends up throwing a TD on a 3rd down at the back end of the drive. Game-winning drive. And then it comes out afterward that he didn't know what the full names of any of his teammates. I was saying to you before, I don't know why this was, because the trade happened on Wednesday or on Tuesday, because the deadline was Tuesday. I'm not exactly sure why he hasn't learned his teammates' names, why he hasn't taken any reps in practice, but they were talking through this. It's not like he got traded on Friday. This is sort of a bizarre element of this story. Is wouldn't he have been in Minnesota by Thursday at the absolute latest, and maybe been there on Friday for their practice? But Joshua Dobbs, as the story has been told, Kevin Seifert has some great reporting. He's been a long-time Vikings beat reporter, works at ESPN, that Dobbs didn't know the name, the name thing I already said is kind of not the main point. The main point is he had not taken any snaps from Garrett Bradbury, the center. He had not worked with the offensive line at all. So there's video of him literally on the sideline taking his first snaps with Garrett Bradbury, while all the other linemen are crowded around listening to him practice his cadence so they can get familiar with the way he's going to call the signals so they don't commit, false start penalties. There was other reporting about how Kevin O'Connell is sending in the plays and kind of deciphering them for Dobbs, who doesn't really know the playbook or the call signs and all that stuff. Jordan Addison had a little quote where he was kind of asking in the huddle, like, what am I looking at on this side of the field? And they were kind of deciphering it for him, the different players. Like, that's what these routes are over here. They're just telling him in layman's terms in the huddle. A truly incredible performance to do what he did in terms of leading multiple touchdown drives that come from behind victory. Multiple come from behinds. I mean, they're behind when he takes over already early in that game. Just an all-time story in terms of not knowing what he's supposed to be doing in the offense, not knowing, again, like the full names of a lot of his teammates. Oh, the other part of it was he had not thrown to any of the receivers. That's a huge part of it as well. You don't know where the receivers are in their breaks and some of those things. You just have to feel that out. And at the NFL level, like, you can't hold the ball an extra half second to see the player's break. You need to anticipate the break, which means, you'd like to have been able to have thrown to him before the game, right? Like at some point in practice before the game. But it didn't seem to be that much of a problem for Dobbs, who just put his cape on, extended some plays, made some great passes, scrambled when he had to, and led an incredible comeback win over Arthur Smith, I'll add, which always makes me smile.
We talked a little bit last week about Sam Howell being QB8, Brock Purdy being QB9. And one of the things that we mentioned was that Dobbs was probably a really good free agent add to your teams this week, even as the higher profile player was Will Levis. And I mean, Levis did some good things on Thursday night, but certainly also, I think, reminded people, why there are likely to be growing pains, even as he makes some throws that not all QBs can make. But Dobbs in this one, with the 7 carries, the 66 rushing yards, the rushing touchdown, I think that it's pretty clear cut if he gets some of those weapons back. And one of the things that happens in this game, I don't think that KJ Osborne is an impact player. He's somebody who the Vikings have prioritized on a handful of the biggest negative plays they've had this season, where Kirk Cousins sort of forced him the ball. You get picks as opposed to just trying to work it through Hawkinson and Jefferson. Jordan Addison has been impressive as a rookie. He actually was kept out of the end zone this week. He's been scoring a lot of those touchdowns. But certainly when you are already down some guys, and then Osborne is lost in this game as well, I mean, you're kind of just working with TJ Hawkinson and Jordan Addison here. And so, I don't know. Is that overly ambitious to think that Dobbs is at the very least a borderline QB1 rest of season, assuming that Justin Jefferson does come back and play?
No, and I mean, Cam Akers apparently has another Achilles injury today. Obviously terrible to see for him, but further thins out Minnesota's rushing attack. Alexander Mattison has not been particularly exciting. They traded away an interior offensive lineman as part of their deadline moves. This is a team that has been throwing, and I think is going to continue to throw, especially as soon as Justin Jefferson's back. So you're going to get pass volume. You're going to get the ability for Dobbs to basically just do what he did. Run, have some scrambles and some passing. You're going to get that, whatever. Yeah, Sam Howell profile. I mean, it's not Sam Howell that's been the best example of that type of player for fantasy, but it's, a backup type quarterback with mobility that's also in an offense that is going to be willing to throw enough that he can put up some passing stats, and he's got guys to throw to. Like, he has talent to throw to. There can be efficiency in the passing game, even if he's not the most efficient passer in the world. Because he started out really strong for Arizona this year, did start to struggle in a couple of games down the stretch, missing some throws, throwing some interceptions. And he's going to do some of that stuff too. I was just checking. Actually, when he came in, it was 3-3. He immediately got sacked for a safety right on his first drive. So he had his moments as well. I mean, and you don't really blame him for that at all after everything I just described. The fact that he was able to bounce back and do what he did is what's so incredible. But yeah, I mean, he's going to throw some picks and all those things. It's going to happen. but he's going to have Jefferson coming back and Addison and Hawkinson and all these players you mentioned. And that's the strength of this team. They're going to call passes. They're going to trail sometimes because they don't necessarily have a great D, but they're also up to 5-4 now. And in the NFC, that 7th playoff spot is very up for grabs. You have the Eagles and the Cowboys. You have the Lions. You have whoever wins the NFC South. It's, Atlanta and the Saints are both 4-4 right now. Tampa's 3-4. And then you have San Francisco and Seattle in the West. That's all the division winners and 2 wild cards that have winning records. The 7th team right now would be one of those other NFC South teams, potentially, or Minnesota, who's 4-4, or then you get into 3-5 teams. You get into Washington is 3-5, the Rams are 3-5, but none of those teams is like a clear candidate to fill that spot. I think my pick right now would be probably Minnesota. Winds up as if not in the playoffs, certainly in contention to be in the playoffs in a way that they're not going to just stop playing because they don't have Kirk Cousins. And Dobbs is going to give them enough, and they're going to want to build that up as well if they're going to want to try to make the playoffs or anything. And again, Jefferson's their best player. Once he's back, they're going to call a lot of pass plays. The point is, it's a setup for a guy, even though he's new, to put up stats. They're not going to hide him. They're not going to give Alexander Mattison 30 carries at any point. They gave him 16 today, and they got 44 yards out of it. There's not a whole lot of other options that they have other than, hey, we're going to give Joshua Dobbs opportunity to scramble 7 or 8 times and throw 35 times. That's how you get stats when you have his profile and you have the receivers. It's a really nice setup, I think, and especially the fantasy landscape with how many injuries there are and how many offenses look so dysfunctional. The Vikings, they're not a perfect offense, but they have talent. And Kevin O'Connell's a decent enough play caller. They've been able to put up numbers, in most games. It's you were talking about Sam Howell being QB8. Dobbs is in the ability to be a low end QB1, I think, the rest of the way for sure.
You get the dome. You have a profile that's pretty similar to anything that Deshaun Watson can give you right now, with better playmakers around him, better weather. Again, because of the dome and some of those types of things, it'll be interesting to track. I was excited to see this because the Vikings' willingness to go out and make that move, I thought was really cool. And someone like Joshua Dobbs, who, didn't exactly succeed with the Cardinals, but battled and competed and did enough that another team was interested to see what he could do for them. Really cool stories like this.
And hats off to the Cardinals, who traded him for a swap of a 6th and a 7th. I think they were just saying, hey, we appreciate that you came in and played, because they acquired him at the end of August and played so well for us. And everyone, I think, loved him in Arizona. And this is the vibe on Josh Dobbs is everybody who is around him thinks he's an incredible leader and an incredible high character individual. But they loved him in Arizona. I was just going to say hats off to them for basically giving him away so that he could then go on and keep playing, because they're going to go ahead with Kyler Murray now that, he's pretty much ready to go.
Yeah, that's a great point, because some of these teams, want to manage their trades and their trade discussions to show people how tough they are and that they're not going to get pushed over in these moves, and that if you want somebody, you got to come and make an offer. To do the right thing by your players instead is a very strong note. Ben, the headline game in the afternoon was those Philadelphia Eagles versus the Dallas Cowboys. You mentioned both of these teams are kind of leading the way in this battle for the playoffs. In the NFC, the Cowboys, with the loss, now really fall a pretty decent amount behind the Eagles. The Eagles not huge favorites in this game, and the Cowboys coming in with that gaudy point differential. And yet, I guess, it's easy to say after the fact, but I would have felt very comfortable taking the Eagles in this game at home.
I did. For stealing lines, take the Eagles as one of my official plays. But, they only covered by 2 points, but they did cover.
And, there were a lot of plays here where the Cowboys could have made that look silly, right? You have, I think, one of the best games that I've seen from Dak Prescott. He throws for 374 and 3. I mean, CeeDee Lamb is having an excellent season, and yet so much of what he does is so smooth. And in some of these games where they've had the opponent overmatched, you kind of come away from it feeling like, well, I mean, that's just kind of the way that the game worked out. In this game here, where Lamb goes for 11 catches, 191 yards, obviously he has that play at the very end where he can't get in and can't find a teammate to lateral the ball to. But, I mean, is Lamb now in this kind of same mix with maybe not Justin Jefferson yet, but with a Jamar Chase? I mean, one of the things controversial with him and with these young players versus the older guys as we look at the 1-2 turn in fantasy this year, the guys that we were really looking at were Garrett Wilson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, CeeDee Lamb. I was not quite as interested in A.J. Brown, who has been magnificent, not quite as interested in Stephon Diggs, who has been Stephon Diggs, and then not as interested in Devontae Adams, who that call looks correct. And it was not a great situation there for him. But I mean, with games like we've witnessed the last couple of weeks from CeeDee Lamb, and in this one here where he needed to carry, and Jake Ferguson had a big game today as well. As I was watching kind of midway through, I was sort of wondering what the Eagles defense was doing, especially after that early touchdown. For them to continue to not cover him was weird. But with Tony Pollard really struggling, and with Dak Prescott, I mean, Ben is just, I mean, he's just a guy, right? Now he's the kind of high-end version of that. Most teams would still love to have him as their QB. But, I mean, Lamb has been absolutely amazing to where I feel like he's pushing to be a top 5 pick next year. Was that the main takeaway that you had from this game? I mean, Jalen Hurts sort of overmatched statistically by Dak Prescott in this one, but makes all the plays, including, again, as a runner today, to get the job done. I guess my main experience of this game was just that, unlike so many of the Dallas Cowboys games over the last several years, where when they really do get into a marquee matchup, they don't show up, even though they lose this one. I mean, this was one of the best games of the season to watch. And the A.J. Brown, again, looks good. Devontae Smith makes that highlight touchdown, as I mentioned. I thought that DeAndre Swift, even though he wasn't awesome as a runner, made a lot of key plays at moments in this game. And then you have the CeeDee Lamb performance. I mean, the stars showed up in this one from beginning to end. And, I mean, you had that back and forth all the way through the game. I mean, this is what the NFL is supposed to be like. We've been looking for games like this over the last 2 to 3 years. And, you know, we have the Frankfurt game, doesn't really do it. This game here was phenomenal.
Yep. I think you said that all incredibly well. I'm nodding along. It really was that kind of a game where you're like, man, this is fun. This is what football is. I mean, my biggest takeaway from this game was that the Cowboys are pretty real. And I know for a lot of people that was already the case. They've played 8 games now. In their prior 7 games, they had a 40-0 win against the Giants in week 1. They were up 26-0 at halftime. They had, I think, at least one defensive touchdown in that game, maybe multiple. They had a 43-20 win against the Rams that they were up 33-9 at halftime. A 38-3 win against the Patriots. They were up 28-3 at halftime. And they also had the 42-10 loss to the Niners, and they had a double-digit deficit for the whole second half of that game. They were down 18 plus for every snap after San Francisco's, both teams' first drive in the second half. Dallas had one drive where they were down, I think, 11 to start the second half in that game, and then the Niners scored another touchdown, and then it was 18 plus the rest of the way. The Niners just kept scoring on them. The point is, most of the second halves, basically all the second halves of those 4 games of their first 7, I mean, more than half of their first 7 games have been like 20 plus, they've been these, and when people do statistical looks at things like pace and and pass rate a lot of the time. There are some of the models that will look at snaps that occurred when the win probability, they'll look at a win probability model and say it was over 75% or over 85%. I don't know what the cutoff is necessarily. I haven't seen this stat anywhere. I have to imagine the Dallas Cowboys have run the most snaps with a win probability greater than whatever number, 85% of any team in the NFL. My point is they've played so many weird games. And a big part of that is the turnovers, those 3 blowout wins I mentioned. They also had a big blowout win against the Jets, 30-10 in week 2 that I didn't mention. It wasn't quite as big of a blowout by halftime, but the first 3 blowout wins they had at the beginning of the Giants, the Jets, and the Patriots, they won the turnover battle at least +3 in each of those games. For the season entering this week, they had 4 defensive touchdowns. No other defense had more than 2. So like a lot of these like fluky things, not fluky. I mean, they're an opportunistic defense. You have Michael Parsons, you're going to create some havoc, but you're winning the turnover battle by a ton in multiple games. You're scoring defensive touchdowns. You're doing a lot of things that are not usually, like when you talk about like a betting situation, you tend to bet against those things repeating in a given week. That is why I thought they were going to go into Philadelphia and lose by like 2 touchdowns. Now they were going to have to go play a really good Philadelphia Eagles team. And they played them really tough. If Dak doesn't step on the line on that 2-point conversion that was initially ruled good, and then on review it showed that his toe was on the line, they would have cut it to 3 there, and then they would have essentially been able to get a field goal late instead of needing to go for a touchdown. They would have easily been in field goal range, could have potentially forced OT. In a lot of ways, it really did just come down to his toe being on the line on that 2-point conversion. But I mean, at the very end of the game as well, they're down 5 and they get to a first and 5 at the 5-yard line, and then take a sack and have some issues and wind up on a 3rd and 26 at the 27 and complete a pass, to Lamb down to the 4-yard line, but not able to get in. But it is all very close at the end, even for them to potentially win in regulation. They played a really tough game. They were impressive to me in terms of like what that means for CeeDee and Lamb. I thought Pollard looked as good as he's looked all year. I thought he actually looked good. And part of why I was breaking down everything with their games is I do kind of wonder if some of the Pollard lacking explosiveness stuff is because a lot of his snaps and a lot of his carries have kind of like his workload's been cold in some of those games. And then when he has gotten some carries, it's like, well, just like hang on to the ball. You don't need to make an explosive play when it's a 28-3 game at halftime, right? Like you don't need to worry, like injure yourself trying to run through 3 defenders when it's a 28-3 game. He gets into a tough divisional game here. Didn't get a ton of touches in this one. Only 15 total touches, but had a nice early run with some explosiveness. It looks like his long run was 15 yards. I'm assuming that's the run I'm thinking of. 12 carries, 51 yards, over 4 yards a carry, which for Tony Pollard these days is actually good to see because you used to be 5 yards a carry for him. But I was impressed by him. But yeah, the stuff about Lamb, I mean, I think what I saw from the Cowboys in this game gave me a lot of optimism that going into the second half of the season, I just kind of didn't know what this team was because they've played so many weird games. They've dominated a lot of those. But again, like I said, you can't bank on dominating the turnovers and scoring defensive touchdowns at the rate they had. What happens when that stuff dries up? Well, we saw that they have the ability to play a really tough game on the road against the Eagles, who's the last remaining one-loss team in the NFL. And the Cowboys almost beat them in a game where the breaks kind of went the Eagles' way in this one. So was very impressed by Dallas. And I think the fact that they were able to do that through Lamb, 16 targets, 11 catches, 191 yards. He's a very clear, target dominant number 1 at this point. It is interesting that 4 of his first 5 games, he only had 4 catches, but a lot of those games, exactly 4 catches in 4 of those games. A lot of those games were those blowout scripts. And so when they've gotten into these more challenging games, what have we seen? Well, we've seen 4 quarters of dominant number 1 wide receiver production from CeeDee Lamb. I think, all the questions you were asking me, is he capable of, being in that conversation for top 5 next year, all of that stuff? I do think it's possible. I mean, I do think we're talking about more of these types of games as they start to play more competitive games through 4 quarters going forward.
And you look at this game, I think the kind of storyline from the Eagles' perspective is a lack of aggressiveness and execution late. They get the stop at the goal line, and very much at the goal line, where the touchdown for Shoemaker is overturned. And so they have to start more or less at the 1-inch line. But they take over the ball with a 28-17 lead at that point and go 3 and out 3 consecutive times, allowing the Cowboys back into this game with a chance to win and create a scenario at the end where, because of those 3 and outs, the Cowboys end up with 11 more plays. They end up with more than 100 more yards. They average almost a full yard per play more than the Eagles. So, as you describe it there, where they, really controlled this game and had the best of it without coming out on top, very much is the case. But again, a fantastic game. A lot of fantasy points there. Not huge games for the Eagles players, but certainly you're okay with what you got from both sides in this one. Then there were some other interesting developments on the week. The Baltimore Ravens absolutely hammered the Seattle Seahawks, but a couple of fun little notes from that. Keaton Mitchell, somebody we've mentioned on the show. I mean, he got to play a little bit in an NFL game here and looked. This is another big game in the huge blowout for Gus Edwards. And yet it looks to me like Keaton Mitchell is going to be the guy for the Ravens going forward, or at least he should be. The other thing, kind of fun, disappointing in terms of how he set them up. JSN drops a ball on the very first drive that stops the drive. It would have been an easy 3rd down conversion. But the rest of the way through that game, he looked like far and away the best receiver that the Seahawks have. This is a really pretty disastrous performance from Geno Smith. But when you look kind of going forward, if JSN starts to play the way that I certainly thought he was going to play this season and gives them a 3rd guy, you would expect in games where they're not playing against this Baltimore Ravens defense, which looks like the best defense in the NFL right now, that maybe the future is brighter there. It's kind of hard to see a scenario where JSN plays well and DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett don't completely disappear, where Geno doesn't kind of bounce back and have a better second half of the season than the first half. So Keaton Mitchell, JSN, some mild positives. This game definitely didn't live up to it. I don't know. It pretty bad from the Seahawks perspective. But all told, Ben, when you look back on this week, I think a pretty fun NFL slate when you consider how many teams were on buys. I was going in hoping my teams would maybe get to 100 this week. I don't know that all of them did. But when you're talking about all of those teams on the buys and all of the quarterbacks being injured, we did still get plenty of entertaining football today.
Yeah, we did. Our teams did pretty well together. We mentioned how they've been doing last week. Strong week for them. You try not to dig in, I know, until you've gotten a chance to watch all the games, but they are looking good. I'm sitting there looking at the scores certainly throughout the day. One other minor thing, you mentioned at the top, I had a little topic I wanted to hit on. We never circled back to, but roughing the passer was a big discussion point today. There was a pretty ticky-tack roughing the passer call in the Washington-New England game. There was another one on Sunday Night Football that was getting a discussion point. And I saw from a couple different people the conversation of like not having roughing the passer on sacks because they're not, I guess, actually passers. They're just being tackled. That body weight play is still causing a lot of frustration around the league. And I just want to say, like, I think people are mad about the wrong thing as it relates to this. Like, we cannot stand to lose any more quarterbacks. It's been a huge issue with the NFL. This is the most important position in sports. There are not 32 good quarterbacks. As much fun as it is to say that we're all protecting the quarterbacks too much and they're all too ticky-tack and all these rules are impossible and how can defenders tackle? I don't care if people want to complain about it, but the rules are in there for a reason, and the sport would not be better off if we were allowing these players to get seriously injured. One of the big reasons that body weight injury rule exists as the first one that always comes to my mind is Aaron Rodgers getting his collarbone broken twice in his career because of defenders sacking him, landing on top of him. You don't want to see quarterbacks of that caliber having their quarterback broken. It's just not good for the product. The same people that are saying that's ticky-tack and this and that will stop watching the game once they have to watch, Tommy DeVito play quarterback every single week. And unfortunately, we had Daniel Jones tearing ACL today. And that's, another thing that can happen to a quarterback. Obviously, other injuries can happen. What we don't need is the ones that are potentially preventable by rule. What I do think needs to happen, because some of these are going to be called wrong, because it is hard to legislate, because the officials have to make these bang calls, is, again, and I've called for this for years, we do need to have some penalties that are reviewable. I think specifically personal fouls, body weight injuries, anything that's an automatic first down, player safety injuries. I just said body weight, but what I meant is personal fouls, player safety injuries in particular. I mean, the college level, they do it with targeting, right? They review it, and then they get the call correct. Anything that's in there for player safety, we get so many observers that are saying it's too hard to legislate. Anytime there's one that's ticky-tack or that's wrong. There was one in the Washington-New England game that was clearly not the right call. The defender was sort of rolling over Mac Jones, just sacking him from the blind side, essentially, not doing anything out of the ordinary, not driving him into the ground, not doing the body weight play where it can break the guy's collarbone. None of that happened in that play. It was a poor flag to be thrown in that spot, but that's why it should be reviewable. It doesn't mean we should take that out of it. It doesn't mean we should take out any roughing the passers on tackled quarterbacks. That would then just move us backward. There's a reason those things were put in place. And again, it's to protect the quarterbacks, which protects the sport, not just for our hobby, not just for fantasy football, but because the NFL's product gets really bad. That you see constant tweets about how bad the NFL's product is right now because there's so many injured quarterbacks. And that's really, it's that important of a position. Can we just be real about it? You need your quarterbacks out there. The whatever number of good quarterbacks we have, 10, 15, 20, we need them on the field. That's just the reality of everyone needs them on the field. The advertisers need them on the field. Everyone, it's not just fantasy football players. Roger Goodell needs them on the field. The refs need them on the field. Anybody associated with football wants the quarterbacks out there. But so what I'm saying is we can't repeal the player safety rules that protect the quarterbacks or protect other defenseless players. We should make them reviewable. We should make any personal foul, any automatic first down, I think reviewable. I think pass interference should still be reviewable. I saw it brought up recently as a throwaway to the year they had it. Remember how much of a disaster it was the year they had it? Well, we know that's because the officials more or less wanted to nuke it because they didn't want to be micromanaged. They weren't in on the decision to make it reviewable in the first place. But that's because all of that has been structured very poorly. These are, yes, subjective calls, but we don't think officials are perfect, and that's why they need to be reviewable. We just need to be able to do it in expedited ways, do it quickly. Nobody wants there to be a lot of dead space in NFL games. All of that is true. The main point I want to make is it drives me nuts when the answer to fouls being called wrong and the officials getting things wrong is that we should repeal some of the player safety stuff. That is not the answer. The answer is not making and I understand that roughing the passer is one that gets people, but again, there's 2 or 3 of these called a game. It's not every tackle. It's not that defenders can't find a way to make that's on average. That's the stat. It's not. It feels like they're being called every drive, but they aren't. There are actually ways to tackle quarterbacks clearly because they aren't called on every single tackle, on every single quarterback hit, not even close. So anyway, I wish we would get these rules right. I wish the NFL would do things intelligently, but the NFL does things entirely reactionary, entirely based on media and public response, and then they make changes. And so I sometimes like to discuss this stuff because I would love to see our NFL world talk about the stuff that maybe will make I think can probably influence the actual rules, but maybe make the changes in ways that make sense. And to me, it's not to be, taking away the player safety fouls and things like that. It's to be making them reviewable, making it so that we can fix mistakes that are made because they're not going to be perfect. The officials are never going to be perfect, especially on these rules that are a little bit black, a little bit gray. Doesn't mean the intent behind the body weight thing isn't right. The intent behind it was right. It's still hard to officiate, but the intent behind making that rule, it exists for a reason. Anyway, there's my little 2-cent rant for the week, because that was a popular talking point around the social media water cooler this week.
I like you getting into that, and I think there are a couple of sort of pivotal points there that are important for people to think about. One is that the frustrating thing, I think, for the NFL, for fans, has been that the replay is still so bad in so many cases, where you get used to watching it in other sports and it's so seamless. The NFL, as opposed to making excuses about the difficulty of it, needs to get their replay up to the caliber of what you see in other leagues. That's very doable.
Yes.
And if you have replay that works, then you can fix some of those problems that you're talking about. I have to admit to being very frustrated with a lot of the quarterback officiating, because I think that the reason that is so different for fans is that they really have this sort of long experience with things like offensive holding being very arbitrary and just something that you have to put up with as a fan from when you're a little kid, to when you're whatever age you are now. You're like, I'm very immune to that frustration because the frustration is so long term. And you also, I think, develop that immunity on the pass interference stuff kind of either way, where you're like, yeah, I just know that's going to be frustrating. Whereas the hits on the QBs, especially when they're the perfect form tackle, I mean, when the defender is doing it exactly right and it's a third down, essentially a turnover situation where it's going to be a punt or what have you, and instead the team gets a first down, now potentially in field goal range in the red zone, what have you, that just seems so much worse.
It's so massive.
Like, the defender did it exactly right.
That's why it's got to be reviewable. I mean, I think anything that can be that big of a turning point in the game, there should at least be a mechanism, whether it's the booth can do it, whether we say only the coaches can do it, and they have to put their time out on the line, or whatever the NFL deems as most. I mean, I would do it as like only the booth can review it. But if it's a clear and obvious foul and they want to decide on their own that their official got it wrong, but they can correct it in real time, I just don't understand that. Like, it can't be corrected. And then we see replays and we're like, wait, that was really wrong. No other play has been run. And we know that dramatically impacted the game because it was a third down, like you said, and now they're in scoring range instead of having to punt. Now they're in field goal range instead of having to punt because they got a 15-yard penalty and a first down. That it is a massive play in a game of possessions where there's 10 or 11 possessions per side, to switch one possession from a punt situation to an automatic first down and a field goal and maybe going on to a TD. That has to be, especially when it's clear on the replay, let the booth then say, look, we need to fix this. We have to fix it, right? Like, same thing with the DPIs too, though. Like, when they're 40-yard penalties and it's like, actually wasn't a penalty. And I know the NFL says it's a can of worms, but you nailed it. They're just bad at the replay. I mean, the XFL and the USFL, I know a lot of people didn't watch those leagues. I did watch those leagues. They did it well. Football is not an impossible sport to officiate or to do the review process. Even on penalty calls, they did some, and they did this stuff well. They did it clear and transparently and more quickly than the NFL. And it's not because they had more money to put into the process or anything. That's certainly not the case. They just were smarter about it. The NFL is just a giant, slow-moving iceberg. They're the Titanic, running into the iceberg. They can't make changes to anything. They're too big of an entity. It drives me insane. They get their product wrong because they don't know how to make their product the best version of it. They're just all reactionary. It's ridiculous.
If you fix some of those problems, you can actually have it both ways, which would be good. That you have the correct calls and you have some player safety. There was a hit on the sideline of Patrick Mahomes today where it looked like the officials, and there didn't seem to be great angles of this, at least that I was able to see as I watched through, but almost certainly Mahomes had his foot down out of bounds well before he is hit. And they don't call it, in part because, and I think this only makes sense, if a quarterback is running on the sidelines just like any other player, the defenders have to be able to hit those guys. But if they are out of bounds and they're hit clearly out of bounds, then those need to be penalties. And so that part of it is going to be difficult, but certainly if it's Patrick Mahomes. Now, in this particular case, it didn't end up being that big of a deal because it was definitely not a dirty hit, and it wasn't a hit where Mahomes went down awkwardly, so he's not going to get hurt. But, I mean, that's not guaranteed to be the way that play works out. I would also really like to see the NFL go back to in the grasp on a lot of these situations where quarterbacks are being wrapped up in the pocket, and then the defenders have to make the decision, well, can I throw him down? Do I let my other teammates go and hit him? Is he going to not go down himself? Because some of these guys are I'm going to continue fighting here because I could get away, and I also could not get away, but I could pick up a personal foul. I mean, the quarterback actually is incentivized to try and get himself hit illegally, which isn't great for the product and is dangerous to himself. You would like to see
but
that.
But those are, again, some of the ramifications of not just getting it right. If you knew that you're going to get seen on replay when you're, trying, because we do see that, right? Mac Jones is one of the worst of all the quarterbacks in the league, and it just so happened, he didn't really do it on that play, but just so happened he was the center of this controversy today. But if they knew that them doing flopping or trying to instigate a penalty like that, it's so much easier to see on replay than what the officials can actually see in real time.
And you have to also make the play illegal where players are pushing on the back of teammates. I don't have any issue with what the Eagles do in terms of the competitive advantage. The fact that they do it well and nobody else can do it that effectively, I think is great for them. It's not anything where you want to get rid of that play to penalize the Eagles, who, they've managed to perfect something that is hugely valuable. But in terms of the player safety kind of across the board, the Trey McBride touchdown, not from this week, obviously the Arizona Cardinals did not score this week, but from a week ago, where you're in a scrum for seconds on end. And as the officials come back and talk about it, and I believe it was Gene Steratore on that one, although don't quote me on that necessarily, he's talking about how that probably should have been blown dead if for no other reason than player safety. And if you're going to let those runners be stood up and get into those, rugby type of situations for that long, defenders have to be allowed to come then and hit you, which is not at all the way that you want that to work. There are still very clear-cut things that the NFL can do to make it a safer game. And Ben, unfortunately, it's not just a matter of the quality of play for quarterbacks, but it's a matter of health long-term for these players that continually the NFL has to address. I think that they're making some effort there. And as fans, I think we need to support all those efforts. So love what you had to say on that. We want to see roughing the passer called when it is roughing the passer, called correctly, not affect these games. Ben, we got to get you to bed here. Stealing signals is not going to right itself in the morning. This has been a lot of fun. So glad to be healthier and able to do it again this week. That'll do it for tonight's episode of Stealing Bananas. I am Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch. You mentioned the fantastic betting project with Dalton Cates as well, Stealing Lines. Make sure you get signed up for that. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz, the coupon code RVRadio2023 to get a 10% discount at checkout. We really appreciate all the ratings and reviews you guys leave for us. It helps us a ton with the algorithm. Good luck on Monday Night Football. Ben and I have a lot of key guys going. Maybe this is the week Zach Wilson becomes a true NFL player. We'll talk to you guys soon.